what are we drinking?
You call it. How about Corey? What should we drink to, Corey?
Whenever my daughter cries and we can't settle her, we say she's crying for a Basque homeland. So for a Basque homeland.
Basque homeland.
Absolutely, man.
You being a father of pretty much a newborn, your child is 4 months old?
3 months and 1 week.
3 months and 1 week.
Congratulations, man.
Thank you.
No.
When I was reading Little Brother,
Mazel tov.
it is the most transparent attempt to bring this sort of mimetic heirloom to future generations. How much did your approaching fatherhood have to do with that?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think of how much of that book I wrote after we knew that we were having a baby. No, I guess I wrote it all after we knew we were having a baby. That was after Alice got pregnant. So, funny thing, we thought it was going to take 2 years. Took 4 days. To get pregnant. Yeah, a friend of mine who's
2 years and 4 days.
A friend of mine asked me the other day, like, what advice would you give someone who's trying to get pregnant? It's like, don't try unless you're ready for it to happen tomorrow.
Don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes.
Right? Honestly, like you never point a loaded gun at anything you don't intend on destroying, right? You never take the goalie out of the net unless you're ready to score. It was a big piece of it. It really was. Fatherhood and impending fatherhood actually does rewire your brain, which I guess makes sense because the selfish DNA that we are just vehicles for is all about kind of rewiring you. Someone asked me the other day a really similar question. They said, how has being a father changed the way you write now? And I said, well, I don't know exactly, but I'll tell you that they're like emotions I've never felt. Some very nice positive ones, but stuff like I got caught in a crosswalk after the light turned, and a guy just revved his engine and kind of blew through and nearly knocked me down while I was pushing the baby carriage. And I was gripped by this like atavistic rage that even when I used to be a cyclist. I used to be a winter cyclist in Toronto, which is, it's the most angry, self-righteous thing that you can possibly do is ride a bicycle through the Toronto winters. And, the number of times you really want to put your U-lock through someone's window and that kind of thing. It really high, but it was nothing as nothing compared to the feeling I felt when this jackass nearly ran over my daughter in her baby carriage. Right. It was like I was like, is there something I can throw through his rear windscreen that would cause him to crash so that I could catch up with him and strangle him with my bare hands?
Was he driving a BMW?
No, everyone in London drives a car that looks like a clown car. It was tiny, tiny, and had 8 people in it. And got 700 miles to the gallon as they do in Europe. No, it was. So that was pretty odd. I really do. I really do now think about writing for the kid. I'd love to write like a kid's book at some point.
Sure.
I don't know yet what it'll be about, but I'd love to write one someday.
That'd be cool. Awesome.
Cool.
Well, so was there some experience that you had as a younger kid that kind of drew you to wanting to give that experience to a young adult?
Well, there were a bunch of kids' books, young adult books that I read that really kind of rocked my world. The one that I keep mentioning, especially here in Chicago, is Daniel Pinkwater's Alan Mendelsohn, The Boy from Mars. Pinkwater's, he was a former Chicagoan. He wrote a memoir called Chicago Days and Hoboken Nights. And it's all about the joys of getting really good Polish sausage in the middle of the night in Chicago in the winter. So, and Alan Mendelsohn, The Boy from Mars, is basically the most awesome book about being a geeky, precocious kid I think ever written, and completely blew me away when I was about 12. And I must have read it kind of 30 times since. But I've always been a big young adult fiction reader. I've always read a lot of it. And continued to read it as I grew up. When I worked in a bookstore and libraries, it was some of my favorite stuff to check out as it came in. It's always been a place where it's been of little critical regard, which means that people can get away with doing really awesome stuff there.
And is that still true today?
I think so. Even though it's commercially huge, in the same way that comic books were commercially huge at the time that they were under attack as being great corruptors of morals and so on, and young adult fiction outsells, like especially science fiction, outsells the adult equivalent, sort of 10 or 15 to 1. Wow. It's not critically attended to in the same way. So people might think about it in terms of like moral panic about what's in the books that their kids are reading. But there's not a whole lot of people like trying to, trying to kind of define or cabin off what is and isn't YA fiction. And so there's lots of great stuff happening there. Okay. Really experimental stuff.
Like what?
Well, I'd say that, you get books like Susan Polwick's Flying in Place, or Scott Westerfeld's books, or Justine Larbillastier's books. It's really weird, experimental, often very politicized, really, really good stuff. Kathy Koja, who, she's a friend of mine, she was one of the great horror writers of the late 80s. They invented a new portmanteau word to describe what she was writing. They called it splatterpunk, right? It was super, super Baroque, very, very kind of lush and very graphic horror novels. And she gave it up to write these incredibly spare, whittled down, very, very sharp-edged young adult books that, like, Hemingway could have written them. They're so spare and simple and declarative and really, really good. And that kind of stuff is just so awesome that it's happening in this super commercialized, really accessible way that tons of kids are being given access to, but kind of below everyone else's radar.
Cool.
You mentioned in the notes that this is the first book that ever kind of came out of you in one go.
Yeah.
What did that? Can you talk about that experience? How did it feel? How did it feel coming on before you actually started to get it out?
Well, so pretty much all the books I've written start with a kind of moment of inspiration where usually I'll sit down and write a couple thousand words as a kind of treatment, and then I'll send that to my agent or whatever, and then I'll gradually work out the book, a couple of pages a day, or sometimes 3 or 4 pages a day. But Little Brother, I wrote 100,000 words in 8 weeks, from the day I started it to the day I finished it, and from the day I thought of it to the day I finished it. And so it started much like everything else, and exactly the same thing. I wrote a couple thousand words, sent it to my agent that night, but the next morning I woke up and wrote like 6 pages, and then that afternoon I wrote 8 more, and there were days when I wrote like 10,000 words and only stopped because my hands hurt so much I couldn't type anymore. I was just writing everywhere. Anytime I could open up my laptop and write, I sat down, opened up my laptop, and wrote more. I was writing, like, literally, I would write on the tube in London, and I would have more to write, and so I wouldn't close my laptop. I'd get on the escalator, and I'd balance it on the escalator handrail and keep typing as I went up the escalator.
Wow.
And, then I'd go through the turnstile, and I'd just sit down, kind of crouch against the wall and finish the paragraph and close my lid. It was pretty amazing. It was like having this book kind of batter its way out through my fingers, but it wasn't really very pleasant. It was, I think every writer fantasizes about having a book just kind of materialize and write itself, but it was really draining for this to happen. It was really kind of hard physically and emotionally hard on me to do this thing. I say it was kind of like trying to pass a pineapple. It was really something. So I'm kind of glad to go back to writing books a couple of pages a day. And I always tell my students, the last thing you want to be is the kind of writer who only works when you're inspired, because then it's not a job. It's just it's like this holy fire you spend your whole life trying to capture, and you'll never be happy. I mean, you might write good work, but you'll never be happy, right? Like, garbage men don't get garbage men's block, and surgeons don't get surgeon's block. They just do the job. And if this is going to be your job, if you're going to be an actual writer who just writes, then you just got to write, even when it doesn't feel like a day for writing. You just got to write, and basically, the days that you write and it feels like sheer genius, and the days that you write and it feels like just crap, if you go back and reread it 6 months later, you won't be able to tell which was which.
Yeah, that was always Burroughs' thing. He was like, if I got struck by inspiration and thought this was a fantastic thing and wrote for hours and hours, I go back the next day and realize it was all shit.
Yeah, exactly. So it's that kind of thing is really. I think it's really true. I mean, it's not true that all inspiration is shit, but
right.
That it's the difference between the work that you do when you're inspired and the work that you do when you're not inspired is almost entirely in your head and not on the page.
And just tempering the muscle to kind of
What,
even out between the two things.
What kind of revision did you have? A lot of revision on this, because it's extremely tight if it just kind of all came out.
There's a little bit in there. There were a couple of scenes that my editor asked me to rewrite, and I rewrote the ending, the last like 10,000 words or so,
to make it one volume.
It was going to be 2 books, and then it became 1. And so there's some of that, but more or less it was it all came out in one go. The big fight I had with my agent and my editor was, and it wasn't that they disagreed, but they felt like in terms of being true to the genre, that he should just win.
Yeah.
Right. Like he should just he should just be. And I was like, no, he's got to go to jail.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, like, he broke the law, and there's no conceivable realistic outcome in which someone who does the stuff that he's done doesn't face the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
And you don't defeat the DHS by breaking the law. You defeat the DHS by changing the political system. And so he ends up getting involved. He well, I don't want to give the ending away.
No,
but he ends up enmeshed in the criminal justice system, right? Because you have to.
Yeah.
Right. Even if you go underground, and that was what was going to happen in the second volume, it still ends always with either going to jail or not being political, right? Because if you're political while you're underground, they'll find you.
Yeah.
They'll find you. Yeah.
Wow, what a cool young adults novel that the hero goes underground.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll do that in another book later on. It was, the other thing that I really wanted to do with this book, in addition to being kind of faithful to what I think is the way that real politics happen, is I wanted to be faithful to the way that real technology works. So, we just seen this string of like terrible summer blockbusters that were nominally techno thrillers. Which my friend Bruce Sterling says a techno thriller is a science fiction novel with the president in it. But these techno thrillers were full of technology that just was just bullshit technology. Like
is the Die Hard 8 or whatever.
Die Hard 11.
Oh, the new Die Hard was awful.
Oh man, and there were just a string of these crappy techno thrillers where the technology made no sense, and I was like, you know what, technology is fucking awesome.
It's awesome,
right?
Yeah,
exactly. and like, you can write incredibly tight, really exciting, really mind-blowing technological adventure fiction in which everything that happens could really happen. Yeah. You don't need to invent like the magic GPS technology or the magic satellite technology that can visualize buildings at right angles. Where you've got someone who's like shooting a picture. I forget what movie this was from, but they're shooting a picture of someone on the top of a roof, and they're like, "All right, I want you to rotate that 90 degrees so I can see their face." And it's like, it's in space, man. You can't rotate it 90 degrees. It's in space. I mean, maybe you can get them to look up at the satellite, but the satellite can't come around to that angle. But there's so much cool stuff that you actually can do with technology. And I thought, like, let's just write a book in which the technology's real.
And it's been a long time since there's been a book that's done that too, right?
Well, I don't know if no other book has done it, but I think since
Tom Clancy kind of was all about that.
Yeah, but that's not. But that was turning kids' heads.
No. Wait, that's not. But Clancy was all about trying to explain what the technology.
That's a good writer too. Who's trying to be real, right? But given some Easter eggs to kids to go and then hit Google and try to get more of this information.
There's a part where the character there's a couple places where your character actually says, "Just Google it."
Yeah.
Instead of you giving a long explanation of something, and I remember reading that and being like, yeah, that's way better than trying to reread an explanation.
It's the best instructional you can get.
Of all the feedback that you've gotten thus far on your project, I wonder how much of your expected or your intended reaction that you've gotten from kids, like as far as kids actually digging their claws into actually learning this shit and getting turned on.
There's been a ton of that, and the book's only been out for like a week, but I've got a ton of this kind of fan mail, and I got an email from this great kid in San Francisco. And it was, and I forwarded it to my editor, and he was like, "You got a fan letter from the protagonist of your book." He's a really neat kid, and I hooked him up with some people at Electronic Frontier Foundation. He's going to intern there this summer.
Oh, fuck yeah!
Really good.
That's fantastic.
I'm gonna send the link to one of my nieces who, when she was 6, she was actually designing web pages.
Oh, nice.
With JavaScript.
Nice.
She was 6 years old.
Damn. Was she exploiting bugs using JavaScript? Was she like poning people's
I don't know. I'd have to
computers.
Let's just say she's really fucking smart.
Right. I'd love to see a 6-year-old bot master. That would be pretty
awesome. I like that in the early on when the main character actually he rents some time on a botnet to get rid of the bully.
Yeah, that's a little thing I've been noodling with, is that we hear all this stuff about how botnets are so gigantic.
Yeah.
I mentioned this to this guy I was talking about before, with John Gilmore, is one of the founders of EFF, and I was like, do you really think that like 1 in 4 computers? Vince Cerf said he thought 1 in 4 computers might be compromised part of a botnet, and he was like, well, I doubt it. And the reason I doubt it is because if that happened, then time on botnets would have crashed, right? Like you would be getting spam asking you if you wanted to buy time on botnets. You do get a fair bit of spam asking you if you want to send spam, which is really a rental for botnets. But it would be getting like really, really heated, right? Like anytime the cost of a resource crashes, you get big marketing wars, right? Mm-hmm. And you don't see it. So it's not like drugs where a criminal cartel can in a local area control the supply of drugs by force majeure. Compromising computers and turning them into your own botnet is something that's very distributed, and it's by definition hard to figure out who's doing it. So even if like the Russian mafia wants to go and like kneecap people who make competing botnets, finding them is like really non-trivial, right? Yeah. So if botnets are as powerful and as prolific as we think they are, then I think we'd see a lot more advertisement for botnet resources. And so this is one of the conceits in the book is that maybe this has actually happened to the point where high school kids just routinely rent time. I need 15 seconds of 40,000 computers to make Skype calls all at once to this guy's phone so it crashes.
Right.
Maybe
I mean the statistics are for that the Storm botnet is just out there with as many as 1.5 million computers.
Yeah,
which is more than enough to take out cities if you want to.
Sure, I think so. I mean, the kind of during the Zoetrope season of Worms, the Torex, which is the main internet exchange for Canada, 98% of the long distance traffic in Canada and a significant fraction of the internet traffic is routed through this one building at 151 Front Street in Toronto. Torex went down because the Monte Carlo probes that I think it was Zoetrope was doing, which were just sort of random IP address probes on port 80. They overwhelmed the administrative interface on these big Cisco routers.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So it wasn't like that they were susceptible to the actual worm, but if you opened up like 50,000 connections to the administrative interface, the routers just fell over, right? And like denial of service, there's a certain elegance to that kind of brute force attack where you just overwhelm a resource. And I would think that Stormworm could do some pretty bad stuff. Although, those guys, it seems like, for better or for worse, the people who run those big botnets, they're not wreckers, they're crooks.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. They're trying to make money.
Right,
Yeah.
Right, they're trying to sell personalities.
Yeah. Or if they're DOSing people, they're either DOSing their competition or they're DOSing internet casinos as part of a shakedown.
Yeah.
But there's no advantage in them doing DOS attacks though.
In general. Well, but I mean there is the whole like you go to an internet casino a week before Super Bowl and you bring it down for 48 hours and you come back and you're like, if you don't want that to happen during Super Bowl, we need $50,000 wired to this account.
Right.
Which they'll more than happily do.
Yeah.
Have they done that? Is there?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there was a good story in Wired last year about a guy in Costa Rica who's built like the DOS-proof load balancing cluster for internet casinos to try and resist the shakedown artists.
Yeah. Well, even the FBI Brent Dempsey here for InfraGard was talking about how they only can suppose how many corporations have been shaken down in similar manner because no one reports.
No one
it.
wants to report
No one
it.
ever
Right,
reports it.
right. Yeah.
Let's take a break.
When was the first impression that you got when you were a kid or whatever, when you decided to write, that would be the mode of expression that you would?
Yeah, so in 1977 I was 6 and we went and saw Star Wars and I came back and I took a whole bunch of paper and stapled it down the side and trimmed it to paperback size and rewrote the Star Wars story with my own embellishments and said I was going to be a writer.
Nice.
And a kind of 6-year period of kind of fickleness as you do between 6 and 12 and for a while I was going to be like an astronaut or something.
Sure.
Deep sea diver.
I'm still going to be an astronaut.
Marine biologist. But then in the end, I came back to it when I was 12. I said, I really am going to be a writer. And I started sending out stories when I was 16 and started selling them to like semi-professional markets when I was 17. I cracked the big ones like 10 years after that. And then 3 years after that, when I was 30, I got the Campbell Award for Best New Writer, which is awarded at the Hugos here in Chicago, actually, at the World Science Fiction Convention in 2000. And so for Best New Writer, kind of 13 years after I started sending stories out, which is a long time.
To be a new writer, yeah.
To be a new writer, but that's how it goes. Every overnight success is 10 years in the making. So, so pretty much all along.
Wow. Who if I may add just one more quick and very complicated question for a man as well read as you. Who would be among your favorite writers?
Well, if I were the kind of person who had like easy top 10 lists, I would have written 10 blog posts and not 30,000. But
sure. That's why I put the preface.
But there's a whole ton of them. I mentioned Daniel Pinkwater and Kathy Koja and Scott Westerfeld and Justine Larbalastier and John Scalzi and of course all the great cyberpunk writers, William Gibson and Bruce Sterling. Bruce is actually my daughter's godfather.
Oh, nice.
Really, really cool.
That's great.
And Rudy Rucker and Terry Bisson and Judith Merrill, who was also a friend and a mentor of mine when I was young in Toronto, and Kate Wilhelm and Damon Knight and Rod Serling and
nice.
Ray Bradbury and Octavia Butler and and then of course some of the classics,
George
of American
Orwell
literature and British
Heinlein?
Orwell, Heinlein,
Not so much?
Twain, Poe.
Okay.
There's actually a really, really sneaky Pit and the Pendulum reference in Little Brother that no one's caught yet. I'm not going to tell you what it is.
Snap! I'm gonna go home to my complete Poe and try to figure it out.
I'll give you a hint. It's the last line in the Pit and the Pendulum has a direct homage in Little Brother.
Okay, fair enough.
I could go on in that vein for about an hour.
Well, what about the Beats? What about Jack Kerouac?
Jack Kerouac, absolutely, and Allen Ginsberg.
Now, why were you compelled to give them such an extensive nod in Little Brother?
I don't know. It just seemed like the right kind of thing to do. I mean, it's just such a big piece of San Francisco history, and harkening back to earlier countercultures, I thought made a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Talking about the similarities and dissimilarities of counterculture through the different eras. I think if you're trying to get your head around as a kid today what it means to be part of a counterculture, then I think it doesn't hurt to understand how other countercultures worked and failed.
Why is that though? What does Jack Kerouac have to give to a young hacker kid today?
Well, I think that there is in Kerouac a really kind of delightful nihilism in On the Road. A kind of rejection of normalcy in favor of just being the weirdest, happiest mutant you can be. Yeah. and I think that following your weird is a big piece of what makes those kids happy in that book too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I thought about that when I read it. I remember being a kid, we didn't have the internet. And or at least I didn't have a computer. But I remember getting, when I was maybe 15, getting really into prior countercultures, or wanting to get really into them, and having to spend about 6 weeks at my local library that had almost nothing.
Right.
And like my parents calling up all their friends and figuring out this kid won't leave me alone. Could you tell him what books he could read? And it took me, finally I ran across Chicago 7 and the Yippies and then into Kerouac and the Beats and stuff like that. But it was not I couldn't Google it.
Yeah.
It took a real long time for me to find that shit.
Exactly, yeah. There's giant archives of that stuff online now, and a lot of those old counterculture zines are online now, the underground newspapers and so on, and it's pretty cool. I mean, it's easier today to be a member of the counterculture than it's ever been, and to find out about kind of what's come before.
Well, and you can really see a lineage to, you can almost say the Beats were hacking the human consciousness, and Leary was hacking the human consciousness, and a lot of these. I mean, yes, Leary has his own demons and whatnot, and Kerouac had his own demons.
That's for sure.
But as far as laying the groundwork for what came into this consciousness movement that then came into the computer movement and the zine culture and whatnot.
Yeah. I mean,
the direct lineage.
There's a lot of connections into old science fiction fan culture as well, and all those people who are just kind of weird and self-publishing. They're all kind of spiritual brothers, and when you read Damon Knight's Futurians, which is his history of the Futurian house in New York, where all these science fiction writers lived, Isaac Asimov and Judith Merrill and C.M. Kornbluth and Fred Pohl and Damon and so on, and they were basically polys, right? They were basically weird polyamorous, super geeky science fiction weirdos, you know, mimeographing stuff in the basement. They got like investigated by the FBI because people thought they were communist spies because they had like their own printing press and they were all weird and they, you know, wore sandals and had big beards and
They're
stuff.
just geeks, right?
Yeah.
Would you say that like what brings all these people together? Just, I mean, this sounds hippie as fuck.
Passion for life, right?
Well, just a tenacity to dream
Yeah.
and to be like pretty fucking hardcore about it. You know,
I think it's about being unapologetically weird. I think it's about
Absolutely.
I think it's about you know. I dropped out of university and became a computer programmer just after reading the transcript of a talk that Bruce Sterling gave to the Game Developers Conference (GDC) in 1992, called "The Wonderful Power of Storytelling," and which is all about how the wonderful power of storytelling is just bullshit. And there's a bit in it where he says, forget being well-rounded, be thoroughly spiky, woo the muse of the odd. And that I took that advice to heart.
Nice.
Yeah, nice.
Nice.
Very nice.
Yeah.